today I'm getting into talking about like mostly the background of what they call the Greek Bronze Age. That's the thing we'll kind of talk about today. I'll kind of discuss the Minoan culture, the Mycenaean culture that existed. I should have time to maybe even go into like what happens after that period, because you have this so-called Greek Dark Ages that comes in. That's kind of there for a while, and then you got the rise of the Greek city-states, which I'll kind of be getting into later, probably more and more into next week. I know. So that's mostly what I'll lecture about today on this part one on ancient Greece. So anyway, like I said, I'm going to, of course, move on to talk about ancient Greece in the Greek Bronze Age. I don't know if you know much about, Greek culture in general, but if you know about the Greeks, they're the birthplace, of Western civilization, Western culture. A lot of your culture, that develops later, like Romans and other cultures that come in later, are heavily influenced by it. The West, is heavily influenced by, obviously, the ancient Greeks today. We even put on like the Olympics, things like that. But the Greeks were the ones, that invented a lot of things we have today, like history, architecture, a lot of different types of philosophy, Greek plays, something influenced people, Greek poetry, and so on. Even early versions of like Greek science, affected people in general later on, especially in the West, medieval times. And I've got a map showing you like the Greek world here, but you can see here that basically the birthplace of mostly ancient Greece is in the Aegean Basin, which, you can see in that map there. It's kind of like right in the middle between what is like, I guess Turkey, which is over here in Asia Minor now, and then you got mainland Greece over here. So predominantly the Greeks mostly lived in and around the Aegean Sea. And there was a famous comment that was made by the philosopher Plato. He once said that the Greeks sailed around the Aegean like frogs around a pond. I don't know if you've heard that before. It was a famous quote. But they weren't just there. The Greeks settled in other areas like southern Italy. You can't see Sicily, which is kind of to the west of. They settled over there too. They were like in around Byzantium, like in the southern Black Sea, also in this area. Pretty much Western Turkey. You had Greeks living here. And actually had Greeks that actually at one point they say went all the way into Europe, like as far away as Spain, that settled. So the Greeks were all over the Aegean and Mediterranean world overall. But yeah, ancient Greece as itself as a culture began like 3,000 years ago. So it's considered, a type of culture that not just influenced other people, but it's considered to be one of the first European civilizations that first, starts at that point. The term Europe, by the way, is a term that kind of evolved from Greek mythology. I don't know if you ever heard of the so-called mythical story of Europa, who was a consort of Zeus. She was supposedly this, if you go to this map here, she was a princess who was from Phoenicia. And Zeus supposedly kidnapped her and brought her all the way to what is Crete right here. She gave birth to some of the first monarchs of Europe, including King Minos. You may have heard of the so-called Minotaur legend. And so you study about, Europa. Europa is considered like the so-called mother of Europe, I guess. I think it was Galileo took the name and named one of Jupiter's moons after her. So Io, and I think Europa is the other. Io is another, I think, lover of also Jupiter or Zeus. So anyway, kind of talking about, just the background. If you look at that map there, kind of to give you an idea, I don't know if you know much about the geography of that area, but the area of Greece is in like the southern or southeastern part of Europe. So it's kind of like closer to Asia, in like the so-called Near East, as they call it, basically. But it's all part of the Balkans Peninsula, like that whole area coming down from like where Yugoslavia used to be over here, got Romania, Bulgaria over here, going down into Greece. That's all part of the Balkans Peninsula. So that area, so that's where Greece basically is. Greece is, by the way, made up of all kinds of things. So it's got connecting peninsulas. I'll get to it later, but two most famous peninsulas, I think in part of Greece is the Peloponnese, which is the bottom of Greece, the southern part, where Sparta is later. And then Attica is this little peninsula where Athens is. So those are kind of like very famous areas. There's other parts too. Like if you go to the map here, they call this area Thessaly. That's Boeotia. This is like Thrace up in here, or Thracia. Macedon or Macedonia is up here. This area here is kind of like what they call Ionia, which is up in here. So those areas. But you can see that the whole area of Greece, like I said, is a bunch of also connecting islands. There's hundreds of islands, throughout the Aegean basin that they've got. The ones that are on the bottom, you can see there, like above Crete. I'll get to them later. We call the Cyclades, like where Santorini is. Also mountains. Yeah, they all have mountains in Greece, of course, as well. Mount Olympus is the tallest mountain, which is more into the northern part of Greece. I think close to Thessaly. It's like 9,500 feet tall. So that's kind of the idea of the kind of mountains that they have there. But you can see they've got a lot of connecting seas, throughout the area as well. So I'm going to get in today, like I said, talk about, the Greek Bronze Age, which the Greek Bronze Age is really a collection of different cultures. There's really like two of them they always talk about, which are the Minoan and also the Mycenaean cultures. These were like these pre-Greek type cultures that existed in ancient Greece like a long time ago. They also call it pre-Hellenic. They'll sometimes use the term Hellenic age or the Greek age to describe the later Greeks that come in and take over, like during the Iron Age and all that. And most of the history of that time period is based on archaeology. It's also based on the works of Homer, especially when you're talking about the Mycenaeans and all that. But most of them lived in either mainland Greece, or they lived in Crete, the island of Crete, or the islands in the Aegean, like the Cyclades, as well. Traditionally, they thought for a long time, by the way, that Greek culture started during the Olympics, like the ancient Olympics, going back to the 8th century BC. But it's like 776 BC, they thought traditionally. But they now think that from archaeology, that Greek culture, early Greek culture there anyway, went back at least 3,000 years or more originally. Hey, Nat, what's going on this morning? Hope you're having a great time out there. So let me go ahead and talk a little bit about the first culture that really comes in, which is we're going to talk about the Minoan culture a little bit. I'm kind of going to spend a little time talking about this man named Arthur Evans, of course, the guy that originally found them. Minoan culture itself flourished originally on the island of Crete, but it was, like I said, in the southern Aegean is where it was based. The Cyclades, like is in the southern part of Aegean, like Santorini, they traded throughout that region, like maritime trade with like Greece, with Cyprus, with also the Egyptians. So they're kind of trading back and forth. And so they're kind of like much about the Phoenicians and all that, which I think appear about 1200 BC or so. They're kind of like similar to that culture. Although obviously the Minoans go back a little further than they do originally. But what they know about the Minoans is that they were discovered in the late 1800s by this British archaeologist named Sir Arthur Evans. He came to Crete because he was influenced by Heinrich Schliemann, who was one of the pioneers in Mycenaean culture. He told him to go there because he thought there might be more evidence of Mycenaean culture in the Aegean. So he went there and he discovered basically this separate culture there, which he ended up calling it Minoan, was the term that he coined which I'll kind of explain a little bit later about that. But it's because of a king named King Minos, you may have heard of, that was kind of went back to Greek mythology that was real popular. And so he started using that term. But Evans is famous for discovering the archaeological site of Knossos, which was a palace complex that was built on the island of Crete. It's near Heracleion, just like one of the major cities on Crete today. And like I said, influenced by the, these so-called tales, of King Minos, the so-called Cretan ruler, I guess they called him, really. He started calling him Minoan after King Minos. And so, of course, the name stuck basically after that. And the Minoans were a type of culture that built these palace complex type cities where I guess the rulers ruled from. And it was also like a kind of a city because it included like apartment buildings where people would live in multi-story buildings. And apparently found like the whole thing like in rubble when he got there. And he started reconstructing it in the early 1900s. He bought like the property there and started rebuilding it, Knossos. Here's some other pictures of Knossos, some of the areas that he's kind of reconstructed. You can see the influence from the Egyptians with the columns right there. And of course, we'll get more into like Minoan frescoes. You can see some of the fresco paintings right there in that picture, something they're kind of known for, the Minoans. And he did discover famously the so-called, where's the throne room? There's the throne room, of course, right there. That's well known, which some claim, they call it the throne room of King Minos, but they're not sure if it's a throne room or not. They think it is, as far as they know. I heard another theory that was used as like a chair for like some kind of religious priestess that was a woman, because the Minoans worship these mother goddesses. They're called snake goddesses. It's kind of weird. Anyway, it might be that instead of a throne for like a king. So it's kind of been debated about that. But if you know about King Minos, he's very famous for the story of the Minotaur. You've probably heard about that famous myth that's well known, where supposedly King Minos had this monster that was like a half bull, half man creature. And supposedly in the original story, what happened was King Minos had this white bull that he was supposed to sacrifice to the god Poseidon. However, he didn't want to do that. He wanted to keep it for himself. And so Poseidon got angry, and what happened was he had Minos' wife have sex with a bull. And so the offspring was this monster, which was the so-called Minotaur. And he built like a labyrinth or maze that was put like underneath the palace. And what happened was I think every 9 years, the Greeks had to send boys and girls to get sacrificed, eaten by it. I think it was like 7 boys and 7 girls. And the king of Athens was the one who was sending all of the children to be, killed and all that. And so his son, which his name was Theseus, he was a Greek hero. He was sent to basically kill it. And he was able to go into the maze and kill the Minotaur. They think it's like a myth, like a made-up story that the Greeks kind of created because they hated the Cretans. They didn't like them. And so they do think that for some reason, bulls was very popular with the Minoan culture. It was part of rituals, fertility. They think it was also part of sports as well, because that's one thing I did want to talk about that's very famous about the Minoans is their fresco art. They're very famous for that, if you know about that, fresco paintings. And I'll get to their language in a little second about that, because they have a language as well. I'll get to that. But yeah, they're known for fresco paintings, which were these lime plaster paintings they would put on walls. They were done in homes and palaces in general. So they'd take lime plaster and plaster the whole wall. And after it would dry, they would paint over it. And most of their paintings are very peaceful. The Minoans are not a very warlike culture, compared to other cultures that come later throughout that region of the Mediterranean Sea. And but yeah, the bull leaping fresco is considered one of the most famous that author Evans found at Knossos. It depicts some kind of like sport or ritual where boys would jump over the backs of bulls, and like kind of like a balancing act, and they jump off. And it's kind of where they think they may have developed this kind of sport that later led to like bullfighting and other things like that are kind of similar. And I think in some cultures, like in Spain, they still do that where they go and they jump over the backs of bulls. And so that's something that they, were famous for. Hey, Tonica, I hope you're having a great morning out there also as well. But they have other fresco paintings. Oh, here's one that's kind of a more expanded version. I kind of added if you want to look at it larger right here. But one thing that amazed me about that fresco is like, that painting right there is how do they hold the bull by the horns? I don't know. I'm not sure about that unless they tied him down. That's kind of a debate about that one. But yeah, they depict a lot of things in nature, like different types of birds. You can see there with this one, that particular Minoan fresco. Here's a bunch of them. So yeah, depicting a lot of the Minoan people. Of course, a lot of these have been restored. That's kind of what they think they look like, because I think artists in modern times have gone back and they painted them, whatever. So maybe they look like that. But you can see, like, they did one thing you see definitely, with those paintings, they didn't wear a lot of clothes. Very warm climate in Crete, as you know, especially in the summer or whatever. So yeah, you see, obviously they don't wear too many clothes. A lot of the men and women had fancy hairstyles, like the women. And also the women were very famous for having open blouses where they would, show their breasts. It's something you don't see too much Western culture, So anyway, this is something that's they're kind of known for. This one's is found in Knossos too, the famous blue dolphins. They have seen that one before. That's well known as well. They're not sure who this Minoan person is. Maybe a prince. I don't know who exactly he is, but it's another famous painting they found too. That's kind of well known. Also, I think it was at Knossos, I think, also as well. But they would put fresco paintings like in their homes, things like that, also as well. Also, the Minoans have like a language system as well. Of course, linear A. They called it. It was actually coined by Arthur Evans. He's one that kind of came up with the name originally. And they think that the Minoan language system is some kind of pre-Greek language system that is not on parallel with the like Mesopotamian or Egyptian writings. So it's kind of a separate type of language system. It was written on clay tablets, just like, they did with cuneiform, like in Mesopotamia. But they didn't use wedges. They used they cut the lines in it, like linear type lines. And so that's why supposedly Arthur Evans calls it linear, because the lines are kind of a linear in length. So that's why it's called that. They used up to 80 symbols. I think most of the language is mostly undecipherable, although I think they're starting to kind of maybe crack it at this point. But one of the most mysterious things they ever found on Crete, anyway, was the so-called Phaistos disc, which you see in the middle. And it's some kind of printed disc, which shows either some kind of alphabet they had, or maybe they think it might be something else. Like it could be like a story, or I think some theory some people have it might be some kind of connection with religion or something like that. I know as well, but I think some people say they've tried to translate it and they're not sure if they have, but most of the language is undecipherable. But they do think the Mycenaeans later were kind of influenced by it to develop their own language, which was later called Linear B, also by Arthur Evans. Here's a kind of a picture too, showing like Minoan pottery, also as well. Which Minoan pottery, they used a lot of that to ship things. Like mostly the things they trade the most, olive oil and wine. They ship like figs, things like that. A lot of pottery ware too. They found pottery ware of different types, like in Egypt, etc. So yeah, those areas they traded: Greece, the Aegean, Cyprus to the east, close to Turkey, and also I think Rhodes, Island of Rhodes, maybe, and also Egypt. So they're big into their olive oil and wine, like you see in Greece later. Now, the Minoan culture, it peaked about, they would say, about 16th, 17th century. And then what they think happened was their culture, they think, was destroyed by some kind of cataclysmic events that occurred. And one of the main things that they think may have caused in the either 17th or 16th century, it's kind of a debate about which it was, they think there was a massive volcanic eruption in the Aegean, which ended up destroying most of the Minoan culture, like caused their decline afterwards. It's called different names. I think a lot of people call it the Thera eruption or the Thera volcanic eruption, and which I do have an image of, like right here, the Thera eruption. Thera was the old name for what they call Santorini. Santorini was like a kind of a home port of where the Minoan fleet was. They also call it Akrotiri. It's one of the names. I think it's Akrotiri, Akrotiri. And supposedly this volcanic eruption destroyed the island, and it caused a bunch of like tsunamis to basically run south towards Crete and basically destroy it. And they think that the tsunamis were so high that actually they found debris halfway up Mount Ida. It was like the tallest mountain on Crete. They actually found debris like halfway up the mountain. So that's how far it went up. So that's one of the things that would cause basically their decline. And if you go to Santorini today, which is in the Cyclades, there's like a big hole, it's like a ring of islands with a big hole like in the middle. You can see all those famous those blue houses with the blue tops on them. They're kind of famous on Santorini today. Big popular place where a lot of cruise ships would dock, of course, if you know about that, and that part of the Aegean. But yeah, it caused the collapse of the Minoan culture. And some historians later think that the story of Atlantis, the famous legend of Atlantis you've heard about, which they made movies and other stories about, over time, might be connected somehow with the destruction of the Minoan culture. The Greek philosopher Plato had, I think, two various treatises that kind of went into detail about what happened to this culture. But I think what Plato said was that this culture, Atlantis, whatever it was, some kind of great civilization, lived about 900 years before he lived. So it put it about, roughly, I guess that would be about close to almost the same time, or maybe further back. But I think about 1300 BC, I think is what he's talking about. But they often say that Atlantis was really in the Atlantic Ocean, like even maybe close to where the Bahamas is, or Bermuda, or something like that has been speculated, or even closer to like where Europe is. So they're not sure if Atlantis really existed or not. It's more like this kind of like a myth, I think, more than anything. But the story of Atlantis, or the story about what happened to the Minoans, is something that the Egyptians told the Greeks. And Plato got it from secondhand information. So it's not something from direct information of where he got it. All right, I'm going to move on next to talk about, of course, the other culture that would come in afterwards. You have another culture that emerges, which is called Mycenaean, that comes in. They're the next ones. And, of course, what happened was the Mycenaean culture, they basically took over the Aegean basin. They come in like in the late Bronze Age. They also call it the late Halidic period, is another thing they call it as well. So after Minoans, this cataclysmic events happened, they were able to take over the whole region, like Crete, Aegean, and of course all the mainland pretty much controlled by them overall. And the Minoan culture was another commercial, civilization that was there that dominated the region. They were the last phase of the Greek Bronze Age. In fact, the name Mycenaean is coined from one of their famous cities in southern Greece on the Peloponnese Peninsula called Mycenae. And so they call it Mycenaean. And I don't know if they know the exact name of what they call the Mycenaeans. I think Homer called them later the Chians, but we're not sure if that's even correct or not. But what they know about the Mycenaean culture was that they were dominated by this very warrior elite society where they had these kings that were called anaxes. The W is usually silent. And they are military leaders, and they're kind of like Agamemnon. You heard of Agamemnon, like in the Trojan War, the Iliad. He was an example of an anax type, warrior king, I guess. And then a lot of their states, whatever, their kingdoms or whatever that were ruled at that time of Greece, were centered around palace complexes, kind of like the Minoans were, but they were built on fortified hilltops, kind of like what they call Acropolis later. And that's something you see that's kind of different maybe from what you see prior to, with the Minoans. Like if you went back to the Minoan culture, like you looked at Knossos, there's no fortifications or anything like that being built. So obviously the Minoans had more of a naval power maybe, and they relied more on the sea to prevent people from maybe attacking them and things like that. What they know about, of course, the Mycenaean culture, Evans, when he was on Crete, found a new language system that the Minoans use, which is called Linear B, also called Mycenaean language, or some people call it the Mycenaean script or something like that is what they sometimes called it also as well. But yeah, Evans coined it because they have Linear A, and then this one Linear B, and some kind of early Indo-European Greek language, like maybe a pre-Greek language before like real Greek comes in, like Old Greek, which comes in later, maybe 1300. I think it when Old Greek came in 2,400 years ago or so, I know. But it's more than that. It's probably more like sometime in the Iron Age you get that come in. But they think that Linear B was a type of language that evolved from, what is, Minoan influences, but maybe even Phoenician influences also later. So possibly both those may have influenced it. They do think that Linear B, led to probably, the Old Greek that'll eventually take off. But I think they say that supposedly part of why they developed Greek was to write down the works of Homer into different Greek, Greek dialects and things like that. Now, most of the history of the Mycenaeans is from two things. They got archaeology, which is the main thing, where they get most information about that period in Greek history, and then also the Greek poet Homer, who lived, they think, kind of a debate 2,800 years ago, maybe around the 8th century BC. Homer, who, by the way, was often called the poet, wrote various epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey. And these were basically, epics that really, talked about the period of the Trojan War. And of course, also the story of King Odysseus of Ithaca after the war. These are very famous epics. And that's also where they get a lot of mythology about a lot of the Greek gods, come from that later. Of course, there's been a debate about whether Homer existed or not. Some people think he was this blind bard poet, and then some people think there may have been more than one writer that may have written these epics also as well. A lot of archaeology has also been done in the region. Of course, here's some pictures of the ruins of Mycenae, Greece, and you can see how a lot of these cities like Mycenae were basically built like palace complexes. Yeah, I kind of did see that right there, a little more of an expanded image, but a lot of these were built like on hilltops to kind of, I guess, protect like their or fortify their region where they're ruling from. You can see they had palaces in the middle, and then they had like a town that was part of it with like some kind of citadel or fortification that went with it. Mycenae is very famous for its entrance. Actually, one of two famous entrances that, of course, that go into the city, which the most famous is called the Lion Gate. The other one is called the Postern Gate as well. And this one, of course, depicts a lot of, early archaeology that you see with, the Greeks, later the Romans also as well. Yeah, so it's one of two major entrances into the citadel of Mycenae. And it is famous for this relief sculpture that's right above, like the doorway on both sides, which you can see there on the left and on the right. And it's a relief showing like these two lionesses with like a column in the middle. And I'm not sure exactly why that was put there, but it's possible it was a coat of arms, maybe that depicted the dynasty or kings that ruled over Mycenae. It could have been the Atreid dynasty, which, that was one of King Atreus and his like King Agamemnon and all that. But one thing that's very famous about a lot of the Mycenaean cities that they use something called Cyclopean masonry. You go to this picture right here, you can see all these boulders like stacked up. That was a form of architecture that they used. They would stack up rocks or whatever to build walls. And that's how they built sometimes some of their fortifications and things like that. But you can see some of the walls look like Cyclops came and stacked them up or something like that. And so that name was often used. Heinrich Schliemann, I don't know if you know much about him. He's this German archaeologist that is very, very famous with Mycenaean culture. He helped to kind of pioneer a lot of the research into Mycenaean culture in the late 1800s. In fact, archaeology was kind of just starting at that point, kind of as part of anthropology, if you know about that. And so he was like one of the pioneers in it. And Schliemann actually was a merchant from Germany that was very wealthy. I think he may have been a millionaire of some type. And he was also a world traveler. He knew multiple languages. I forget how many languages he knew. He knew like 12, 13 languages or something like that he could speak, believe it or not. And he was obsessed, by the way, with the epics of Homer, like the Iliad and the Odyssey. And he really believed that the story of the Trojan War was real. It was a real story. And he used the works of Homer to try to find all these historical places, like in Greece and in Turkey, where Troy is, and all that. The only thing about Schliemann was he was controversial. Like in some of his early methods as an archaeologist, I don't know if you know, but he was known for using dynamite, like to blow up certain sections, to clear certain areas, like he was trying to, excavate or whatever. So he's kind of controversy. It's like in some of his methods, I guess he kind of used. But anyway, at Mycenae, of course, there's various famous parts of it that are kind of well known, like the Tholos tomb. I think around that era he excavated, Schliemann. And the Tholos tomb are these, they're like these so-called beehive, or I think something called dome-type tombs, were built by the Mycenaean culture. And they were used to bury their kings in them or bury treasure in them. And that one you're looking at right there is the treasury of Atreus, or some people call it the treasury of Agamemnon, because it's kind of a debate about who built it or whatever. Anyway, it's how they built them. They would basically build this dome using stone, like a dome type tomb, and they would bury it like with dirt. So it's supposed to look like kind of a mound, like like an Indian mound or something like that. And it's got this main entrance that went into it. Now, I forget how heavy the top of this door is, but it's like, I forget how heavy it is, but it's like 100-something tons or something like that. That's above the door or something like that. The other thing probably the most famous thing that Schliemann did at Mycenae, he found these grave circles at Mycenae, in Greece. And these are like these burial sites where the Mycenaeans buried their nobility, like the men were buried in there. And they employed what they call shaft graves. They would dig a shaft down, they would bury people down there. They would put in like artifacts with it. Like they would bury like their shields and armor with them. I think they buried like their weapons. They found like trinkets and cups. I think even some of the daggers are like solid gold or things like that he buried people. Here's another image showing like a larger size image of the grave circle, like one of the grave circle A that you're looking at. You see all that stacked stone I'm talking about, Cyclopean method they used with architecture right there. These are like better pictures you're looking at. And there was one he found that's very famous that was found in one of the graves. Forget which one it was. It may have been linear A. It may have been circle A. I'm not sure which one it was. But he found this one called Mask of Agamemnon that became real famous. And evidently some of the nobility put like a death mask on their face, like something the Egyptians would do. There's Schliemann right there. And I found in 1876. He claimed it was Agamemnon's, but they're not sure whose it is. So that's kind of a debate about that. The other thing that Schliemann did also, he went to Turkey as well. That's something that's well known, Turkey. And he found what they call Priam's treasure. I don't know if you know about Turkey, but they think Turkey, the northwestern part of it, they think that may have been the original site of where ancient Troy was. And like that Homer talks about in the Iliad, which they call it a long time ago. They call it Isarlik, which means I think it's a Turkish name or nickname meaning place of fortifications, because it was an ancient site that was used a long time ago by different peoples, going back to like the Hittites. May have fortified that area. And I think I've got a map showing you like the location of where it is. I kind of bring it down here, but they think Troy was located like right maybe here, close where the Hellespont is. Just a little waterway running between Europe over here and Turkey or Asia Minor right here. And so evidently this area was heavily fortified to try and prevent people from controlling a lot of the trade throughout this region. And up to a long time later, it's kind of important, up to like, I think, Roman times and all that. So that's kind of like the area that he went to. But he found this treasure buried in the wall at what they think is Isarlik or ancient Troy. And it was like a lot of artifacts that were mostly made of solid gold, which he claimed was Trojan, but they're not sure whether it was or not. It's still debated about the time. They don't think it's the same time period as the Trojans. That's the only thing about that. But it's kind of a weird story, but apparently all this Priam's treasure ended up in Germany. That's the other controversy about Schliemann. He actually stole it and basically took it from Turkey, or I think the Ottoman Empire was at the time, took it from them and brought it to Germany. He ended up in one of the museums in Berlin, and when the Soviet Union invaded during World War II, the Soviets got it and they brought it to Russia, and now it's in Russia, all that treasure. And it might be in Catherine the Great's, the Hermitage probably is where it is now or somewhere. So kind of strange about that. But let me talk a little bit about the Trojan War. Was the Trojan War a real war? They're not sure or not. They think it was a possible war that was around like the 13th century BC. Like if it took place maybe like 1250 BC, I think has been a popular date of when they think the Trojan War happened. But possibly the Greeks and the Trojans tangled, which maybe it was over a woman, maybe. But I think a lot of people think it could have been over trade, like controlling trade throughout the Aegean, because both were, used bronze technology. And I think there's a theory that the Trojans had a lot of tin mines throughout that region, which is important, for making bronze, because you got to add tin to copper and all that. And so I think I heard that theory that may have been why maybe they fought the war as well. Of course, Homer said no. Homer said it was a woman named Helen, by the way, not Schliemann's Helen, by the way, that was one of his wives. But the other Helen, which is Helen of Troy, that's the one, of course, that they supposedly caused the whole war to break out. And it actually was caused by this quarrel among the Greek goddesses. They were kind of just talking about like who's the most fairest of the different goddesses. And so they gave this apple discord that was made of gold to Paris, the Trojan prince. And he picked Aphrodite as the most fairest. And so at the time, Helen of Troy was considered the most beautiful woman in all of Greece. And so basically the two fell in love, and basically he brought her back to Troy. But Helen of Troy was really, if you know about that, she was the wife of King Menelaus. She was married to another guy, of Sparta. He was the brother of Agamemnon. And so that sparked the whole war breaking out. But if you know about it, the Greeks said that Paris kidnapped her, and then Paris said she went with him willingly. Yeah, of course. So yeah, Helen, they say, was the face that launched 1,000 ships. So you had a deal where it caused all the Greek city-states to basically declare war on the Trojans, and so they amassed a huge fleet with a force. They invaded, of course, the Aegean to attack Turkey, obviously. I'll kind of go through it because I think I kind of talk about that, I think, in y'all's study guide. But they think the Trojan War lasted about 10 years. But Homer in the Iliad, he doesn't talk about it that much. He only goes through like a brief period in the actual conflict. Homer doesn't even talk about the end of the war. Like, we talk about the Trojan horse and all that. That's actually later stories, like epic stories like the Aeneid by the Roman poet Virgil, kind of goes more into how Troy was, taken by the Greeks. But they're not sure that even happened that way or not. So it's possible it may not have happened. But these are all the major heroes that were in, like the Iliad as an example. Agamemnon, of course, considered the greatest, the leader of the Greeks. That's kind of important. Of course, his brother Menelaus, him kind of started the war. Achilles is considered the most famous hero, in the whole Iliad. He's the king of the Myrmidons. He's their greatest hero or warrior that fights in battle against the Trojans. There's two Ajaxes. Yeah, I think they both got killed. Ajax the Lesser, Ajax the Great. He was famous too. Both of them were. Odysseus was also famous too, king of Ithaca. He's famous for in this conflict, Trojan War, but he's also famous for the Odyssey epic, which is told later by Homer as well. And Odysseus was supposedly the one that came up with the idea of the Trojan horse, they say. And then the Trojans had, of course, King Priam. Priam's treasure we're talking about, of course, supposedly the leader of Troy. And of course, his two sons that were famous. Paris, the one that supposedly started the war when he took, Helen of Troy. And then Hector is the one that's that's the big, Greek nemesis of them. Their hero of the Trojans. He's famous for being killed by Achilles in single combat. So, but yeah, all these stories happen, they don't know. I know for a long time, I think up to Roman times, there was some kind of tomb of Achilles that existed and people would visit it. So some people think they were real people, and then some people think they were like totally fake. So they're not sure. Some people think it's all mythology that we're talking about, and it wasn't a real war. So it's still a debate about whether this happened or not, the Trojan War. According to the Romans, the Romans were the ones that started talking about this thing about the Trojan horse thing, and supposedly Odysseus and some of his men, were put inside this hollow wooden horse, which was given as an offering to the Trojans, and they brought it into their city. They attacked them from within, like a Trojan horse virus or whatever in a computer, kind of like that. And so that's how they think it happened. And there is evidence at Hisarlik, where Schliemann was excavated, that they found like a part of the city that was burned. So maybe that's true. Maybe it was sacked like that, but they don't really know for sure. I'll get to it later when we get to the Romans, but the Romans actually thought that some of the survivors of the Trojans fled to Italy. You may have heard of Aeneas in the epic story of the Aeneid. It kind of settles in Italy, but some of the Romans thought they were descendants from the Trojans that fled after the sack of Troy. All that. That's later, when all that happens. But yeah, the Trojan War was like, I guess they say the last hurrah of the Mycenaean culture. They're wiped out as a culture in the late Bronze Age collapse, which I've kind of talked about before. We had the so-called Sea People invasions that come in about 1200 BC. And so their culture disappears. Their cities they don't sell their cities anymore. The language that they were using before, like Linear B, is not used anymore after that. So you start seeing Old Greek come in later, maybe around the end of the Greek Dark Ages, as they called it. So that's the next thing that really comes in next. Here, by the way, is some walls at Sarlik that I guess were discovered by Schliemann. But if you read like Homer's The Iliad, he talks about the walls being massive, and all this stuff. And the walls like at Sarlik don't seem to be that big that they find. So maybe it's just an exaggeration of Homer and all that with the actual fortification of the walls. I'm going to be getting into, of course, we'll get later into it. We'll get more into getting into the rise of the Greek city-states. That's going to be, of course, my next thing I'll get into, which I'll be more into probably next week. But I did want to talk a few minutes on there's a period before the Greek city-states come in where you have a dark age that comes into Greece. So the so-called Greek, they call it the Greek Dark Ages because of the fact that Greek culture during the so-called late Bronze Age collapsed. You don't have all these settlements like I talked about before that they have. So culture, art, and all the things that I guess the Mycenaean culture was kind of known for at the time starts disappearing at that time. And you start seeing a new group of peoples that come into ancient Greece at that time. They have invasions of the so-called Hellenes peoples or the so-called Greek peoples that come in, like the Dorian invasion you may have heard of before, or Ionian invasion. And the Hellenes is what they call the Greek peoples. It's just like the term Hellenes, it's like the term for Greeks in the Greek language. And they started appearing in the early part of the Iron Age. Now, whether they're somehow related, like the so-called sea peoples or whatever peoples that kind of come in throughout the region, they're not sure. It's possible that the Greek peoples may have been related to the sea peoples, which were some kind of possibly Indo-European peoples that came in, maybe. But what they do know about them is that they were composed of different Greek tribes. Those are the main ones. I think they say there's like 3 or 4 of them that were dominant the most, which were the Dorians, I think is the most famous because of the so-called Dorian invasion. It happens right after the sea peoples attack the region. You got the Ionian peoples. You got the Aeolian peoples. And they have another one they call the Achaeans, which that might be where Homer gets that nickname of what he called the Mycenaeans, because some of the Greek tribes that come in were called Achaean also as well. Why do they call them Helen? Like, what's the deal with that? Like Helen, it sounds like a woman's name, right? But it's not spelled like usually Helen spelled, or Helena, whatever, how they say the name, Helen. It's actually spelled 2 L's, Helen. And they think Helen was some kind of Greek descendant of some type. Now, whether he was a king or a chieftain, they're not sure. Kind of a debate about that, who he was. But it's where the name Helen comes from, Helens, basically. And so you get all these different names being used afterwards. So the term Hellas, you see there, Hellas, is what they call Greece. So you talk about the Republic of Greece today, they'll say Hellas for short, of course. Hellenic when they're talking about all the Greek peoples or Greek culture, whatever. Or I don't know if you're in a sorority or fraternity, they'll talk about all the different fraternities and sororities together. They'll say I think they'll use the term Hellenic or something like that for that, for those type of cultures overall. Hellen is just like just for one Greek person, like talk about one person, and Hellenes is plural, more than one. So all the Greek people. Now they divide like Greek history into different periods. There's like 2 or 3 of them that they have, by the way. They often call it if you go back up here, they call it the so-called, they'll use the term Hellenic age. Sometimes they describe the period of Greece, Greek culture, which are like so-called Greek age, okay, or age of the Greeks. I guess we want to call it that way. We'll use it for short, which usually, like I said, is dated from 776 BC. So that would be when the first Olympics started, which they say started in the 8th century BC. They used to count back to it, supposedly, when it was. It goes down to the death of Alexander the Great, who died in 323 BC. So that's the peak of Greek culture at that time, and also the so-called Greek city-states that exist. Because during that time, the Greeks start founding all these so-called city-states, which are they're not like kingdoms, but they're not empires. They're kind of like this state with a major city around it. Kind of like Athens is in Attica, as an example. I think Sparta, as an example, major city, is in Laconia, in southern Greece, as an example. And one Greek city-state is called a polis, and then I think poli is just the plural version for all of them, which the number of Greek city-states numbers, I think, over 1,000 or more. Yeah, this had hundreds of them throughout the region. They're based basically in the Aegean, on the islands, in different parts of mainland Greece. So they're basically everywhere. Later they expand, like when Alexander gets into it, he'll kind of expand it more, of course, later. But they have 2 periods. They got Archaic or Old Greece. That you have you got Archaic Greece, usually. Old Greece is what it means. Then you have Classical Greece. Classical Greece is the most famous part, like the old part, or Archaic Greece, which is early Greek culture from the Olympics down to like around the time of the Persian Wars. And then the Classical Greece is the period from like the Persian Wars down to like the death of Alexander the Great around 323. And so that classical period of Greece is really the most famous. It's the period when you have all the famous Greek people you've heard of. I'll kind of throw a few on the screen, but Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Herodotus, Thucydides, Diogenes, Pericles, Solon, Sophocles, whoever else. Those are all famous people that were all basically during that time. Euripides and anybody else you kind of think of that was living at that same time. So it's really the peak of their greatest minds, overall. They also have the so-called Hellenistic age. They have that later. It's like kind of a third period with the Greeks. That's where basically Greek culture spreads to the Near East because of Alexander the Great, who conquers, most of like Persian Empire, etc. And you get Greek culture spread to Egypt, Turkey, Mesopotamia, Iraq, Iran, all the way to India at one point. And so you got the Greeks, influencing the world, a lot of the world at that time. So I'm going to get more into Greek culture later. I don't think we have time to really get fully into it, but next week, of course, I'll talk about, the rise of the Greek city-states. I'll talk about the Persian Wars. That's probably one of the most famous events that happened really in classical Greece. It's well known because Herodotus, writes a lot about that. So we'll talk about that. I'll talk about the Peloponnesian War a little bit, and we'll also get later into Greek culture also as well. So that's it for the week. It's like I didn't have too many questions here today, looks like it. But don't forget about various assignments you'll have due. First exam, second vocab, pretty much coming up due first. I might push back the first exam because I don't think everybody's kind of done with that yet. I know. So I know y'all are still working on it. But I might give you a few more days on it, maybe till maybe Monday at the most. So try to get that done. But second vocab will be due next week early on as well. But I do have some other quizzes coming up. The India quiz has been posted early, and then I've got also another lecture I'll have that's recorded on the Phoenicians and Israelites. That'll be also due later as well, which I'll post that tomorrow as well. So if you got any questions, of course, about this lecture, let me know later, of course, on my channel, any day or night. You can send me comments, questions. But it doesn't look like there's too many comments right now today. But yeah, y'all take care. Have a great weekend, Madison, also as well. And I'll see you, of course, next week. So y'all have a great weekend.